Myrna is a Canada Research Chair in Public Policy and Criminal Justice and an Associate Professor, Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph. She is the author of numerous publications and has recently co-authored Violence Against Women in Canada, Research and Policy Perspectives, which was published last year. She is a member of Ontario's Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, the Academic Advisory Committee, Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics Canada, Research Associate, Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, and co-investigator in the Canadian Observatory on the Justice System Response to Intimate Partner Violence. With funding from Canadian Foundation of Innovation, Myrna established the Centre for the Study of Social and Legal Responses to Violence at the University of Guelph. Myrna, welcome, and we look forward to your seminar today. It really is a delight to have you here, and I'm sorry that you're not able to stay longer. And we will, just so that you all know, we have asked for an extension of time so that we're not going to have a shorter seminar than we would have otherwise had with the late start. So over to you, Myrna. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heather. Good morning. I just want to briefly begin by thanking the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research for providing me the opportunity to come and speak with you today, and for bringing me to lovely Mackay, and I wish I could stay longer too. I also want to acknowledge and thank the T.C. Burns School of Law at the University of Queensland and the Canada Research Chair Program for providing support so that I could be in Australia in the first place. I just have to figure out how to get the support so I could stay here indefinitely. Now, because I do have a lot to say, I'm going to jump right into it, and I'm hoping that I'm going to work the technology appropriately. When I'm discussing domestic homicide, I always like to start by having everyone consider three brief scenarios. So scenario one, a stranger enters the home of a woman, and after a struggle with her, he pulls out a gun and shoots her. Scenario two, a man enters the home of a woman, his estranged female partner, there is a struggle, he pulls out his gun and shoots her. Scenario three, a man and a woman who are husband and wife are at home, there is a struggle, he pulls out a gun and shoots her. All three cases involve the same set of basic facts. There is a man, a woman, a struggle, a shooting, and a death. Only one variable has changed, and that's the degree of intimacy that has existed between the victim and the offender. In the first scenario, there was no prior relationship. We're appalled. Can this happen to anyone in their own home? In the second scenario, there was a prior relationship, but they were separated. We're saddened. What a tragedy that a love affair has ended this way. In the final scenario, the degree of intimacy is perhaps the closest social relationship that two people can have. We're resigned. Just another domestic dispute spirals out of control. What could we have done? Why do we have these different reactions to the same set of basic facts? Man, woman, gun, woman primarily, and her death. Because violence that occurs between intimate partners has typically been seen as normal, expected, and something that is typical with the intensity of these types of intimate relationships. At the same time, we also see them as spontaneous, unpredictable, and therefore not preventable. However, the optimistic part of this picture is that with the rise of domestic violence death review committees internationally, in many developed countries at least, we're seeing a growing recognition that these crimes are preventable. And in fact, within the body of homicide research itself, domestic homicides are seen as the most preventable form of homicide that exists. This does not mean that every homicide can be prevented, but it does mean that there is work to be done to identify those points of intervention and prevention that could reduce some of these deaths. We'll probably never eradicate them completely, but they can be reduced. Today I want to talk a bit about the Canadian experience. I'll give some basic trends on domestic homicides. Then I'll talk about the rise of domestic violence death reviews in Canada, and acknowledging that I'm sure most of you know that domestic violence death reviews teams are being implemented across Australia as well. So I'm very interested in the evolution of domestic violence death review teams here too. So, some basic trends on domestic homicide in Canada. Since the mid-1970s, this graph shows the overall homicide rate has gradually been declining, reaching its lowest point in more than 40 years in 2010. So general homicide rates are going down. This decline has resulted from fewer homicides against both females and male victims, but the declines have actually been double for male victims compared to female victims. During this period, intimate partner homicide in Canada has also been declining. In fact, it's declined by about 32% since 1980, shown by the blue line, the middle blue line on the graph. However, the rate of intimate partner homicides against females, represented by the top red broken line, has remained consistently 3 or 4 times higher than the rate of males killed by intimate partners, as represented by the bottom broken line. And this is why domestic homicide is recognized by many as a form of gender-based violence. The importance of these overall declines has been noted by researchers, including myself in Canada and Laura Dugan in the US, trying to determine what is actually contributing to these declines. And some of our work has focused on intimate partner homicide, and some work beyond our own has focused on homicides more generally, because we're expecting that there are some similarities in the contributing factors, but there also would be some differences. And so Laura Dugan in the US came up with what's called the exposure reduction framework. And she argues that this framework means that the premise is that if you are experiencing violence in your life, that some mechanisms that will reduce your exposure to the violence should help you at least exit that violence. So the emphasis is on exposure reduction factors. And she identified 3 broad societal trends that have occurred in the last 30 years paralleling the declines in intimate partner homicide. The first is increasing gender equality, and I'll show some evidence of this in a second, in Canada. The second is changing relationship structures, so the way that people are coming together in intimate relationships. And finally, the rise of domestic violence resources. As most of you know, in the past 30 years, we've seen a significant increase in the types of resources available to both victims and perpetrators of violence. So just take a look at the, gender gap, the closing gender gap. So this graph is from 1976 to 2009, and it shows the employment rates for men and women. And as you can see, the gap in 1976 was fairly large, and now we can see a dwindling of that gap, meaning that women are more often entering the workforce. As well, they're more often increasing their post-secondary education at a higher rate than men are in Canada. So again, the education gap is narrowing, meaning that the gender equality is hypothetically also narrowing. And what Laura Dugan and myself have argued is that that means that there is a certain level of exposure reduction found in women's increasing socioeconomic levels with their rise in employment, and with their rise in education, that should hopefully at least make them more selective in entering into relationships, or they're not prevented from exiting from violent relationships if they have resources to do so. The second, the second trend that was identified by Laura Dugan was the changing relationship structures. And by that I mean the decline in marriages and the increasing divorce rates, increasing types of other unions, such as common law couples or individuals who are dating for lengthier periods of time. So as we can see in this graph, between 1976 and 2000, the average age of first marriage has gotten older, so that on average, both males and females are entering into a committed relationship as defined here by marriage at a later age. In 1974, it was 22 years for women and 24 for men. In the late 1990s, it was 28 for women and 30 years for men. At the same time, women are putting off child rearing, having children, so that in the mid-1970s, the age of a mother at the birth of their first child was 24, and now in the early 2000s it's 27. Again here, the argument is the exposure reduction is that people are being more selective, both males and females, in the types of relations that they're entering into. And then one of the key factors that often keep women in violent relationships, as shown by much of the research, is the presence of children and the concern about their children. Maybe fewer relationships have children before the violence starts occurring and they're exiting those relationships. Now as I talk about this, it's very hard to get your head around these very aggregate trends having an impact on individuals' behavior. So this research is very much in its infancy, and there's a lot more work that has to be done in terms of looking at how these things generally play out, because it has been shown that these trends do have different impacts for those individuals who vary based on their characteristics. So that brings me to the third trend, and that is the increase in domestic violence resources. This is the trend that actually has the least research done. And the problem with this is that there's so many domestic violence resources that have arisen over the past 3 decades, is that it's difficult to actually figure out what we count as a domestic violence resource and how we gather the data that would allow us to look at the provision of resources in different communities and how that would actually affect the rates of violence in that community. But what we do know in Canada, and this is somewhat dated research because again the data isn't being collected consistently, in that the number of, sorry, I'll go back, the number of shelters has risen, as I'm sure is the situation in Australia, from only very few in the mid-1970s to hundreds in the 2000s. And treatment programs for violent men, primarily the focus of treatment programs, has also arisen in Canada during this period. So those are two types of data that we have available on domestic violence resources that has allowed us to examine the link between the rise in those resources and declines in violence. But again, those are two very direct types of resources and doesn't at all capture the breadth of what's actually out there. But this does bring me around to the topic for today, and that is the rise of domestic violence death review committees, which many have argued is a significant exposure reducing mechanism. And here I want to emphasize that it would be incorrect for us to assume that domestic violence death review committees are going to directly reduce domestic homicides. There's a lot of factors that go into patterns in domestic homicides, not just a work of an individual committee. But what these committees can do is actually indirectly reduce domestic homicides by drawing attention to systems that may not be working, policies that may be flawed in terms of responding to particular types of individuals, so they can identify system gaps and ultimately and hopefully produce some cultural change. So I want to talk a bit today about the Ontario Committee because it's the first of its kind in Canada. It's been around since the early 2000s. And so we've had 8 reports come out so far, and I want to talk about some of the general findings from the Ontario Committee. And it is the one that I'm the most familiar with as well, because I sit as a member of the committee. So our committee, similar to many of the committees that have been implemented here in Australia, arose out of the deaths of 2 women. In 1996, Arlene May was killed by her estranged boyfriend, who later killed himself. In 2000, Gillian Hadley was killed by her estranged husband, who also later killed himself. Both domestic homicides led to a coroner's inquest, which is not always the case. In Canada, coroner's inquests are not held into every death, and in fact, they're held into very few deaths. But these particular cases had characteristics that prompted a coroner's inquest to be held. Arlene May had a series of contacts with multiple sectors that had a number of points of intervention that could have been taken up. Gillian Hadley, her killing was very public. She handed off her child to a neighbor as she was being dragged into the house by her estranged partner and was subsequently killed. So it made a very big sort of play in the media. So these 2 cases ended up with a public inquest. So in response to 2 separate recommendations that came out of those 2 separate inquests, the Ontario Coroner's Office asked myself and my colleague Peter Jaffe to work on a background paper that would draw from the experiences of the death review committees in the US, which had been in play, I guess, for about a decade by that point. And so we put together a background paper for the coroner's office that served as the foundation for the committee and the way it was implemented in Ontario. So then, in an effort to see that maybe Ontario was not the only province that would have these committees, Peter and myself co-hosted what we're calling a think tank on domestic homicides in 2008, and we invited 4 other provinces to bring various members of their sectors into a meeting where we all sat around and talked about the benefits and challenges of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. And subsequent to that, 2 of the provinces that were involved in that think tank have just recently implemented death review committees, so that would be New Brunswick and Manitoba, and they implemented their committees in 2010. And they're, in New Brunswick, it's housed within the Office of the Chief Coroner, and in Manitoba, it's housed or operated through the Ministry of the Attorney General. British Columbia was also one of the provinces that attended that think tank, and they held a one-time review, and they're discussing whether or not they'll implement a permanent review, but at this point it's been a one-time only panel. Now, we can't directly link the work of our think tank to the fact that these committees then arose afterwards, but we sort of wanted to assume that we at least had some minimal impact, and so in 2010 we held another think tank that brought together all provinces and territories to talk about again, the benefits and challenges of these committees, but also to look at what's become a big issue is the risk assessment, risk management around domestic homicides. And so we've just held that one, and we're hoping that there's going to be some movement in other provinces because of that work. So I want to talk just briefly about the Ontario Committee in terms of what we do and how we're set up, because I know that the way we're set up is somewhat different than in Australia. So as with all existing committees in Canada, we were not formed under any specific legislation. So there is no legislation governing our committee. Where we fall is within the existing rules and regulations of the Office of the Chief Coroner. And our primary goal, as with most committees, is to better understand, intervene, and help in the prevention of domestic violence killings through a process of identifying risk factors and targeting recommendations to agencies that may have been involved in the response in those individual cases. So our mandate is to assist the coroner with the investigation and review of domestic violence-related deaths, and again to make recommendations. Now this is where I think we differ quite a bit from some of the committees in the US as well as in Australia and the UK, which has adopted another type of model itself. Our membership is made up of a committee of about 12 experts from across various sectors. And so we have healthcare, social services, law enforcement, criminal justice, research, which is myself and Peter, and other public safety agencies and organizations. One of our biggest challenges with a committee such as this has been, one, to keep it manageable, because if you get a group of too many strong-minded individuals together in one room, you often don't get a lot accomplished, but you need to make sure that you have the sectors represented that should be at the table. And so it's been a struggle over the years because there's always turnover with people's varying commitments and schedules, but we have consistently, fairly remained true to this this group of individuals, and we're currently trying to address some of the gaps that we have identified that currently exist in our committees. And I know that in Australia, the committees are somewhat different, as they're housed in the coroner's office, and they're in Victoria at least, there's a violence prevention unit and individuals that work within the coroner's office. So all of us are individuals that come from outside the coroner's office, and we come in and meet on a regular basis, and we review the cases ourselves. Again, where we differ quite a bit from Australia is in our review criteria. And I will say here that our review criteria, we wanted to remain true to what we thought was the impetus for death review committees in the first place when they originated in the US. And that was domestic homicides that occur between intimate partners and that often involved children. Having said that, there also is a resource issue in terms of, if you have a lot of domestic homicides, how do you review them in depth adequately if you have too many? So we opted to keep our focus on intimate partners and not go beyond that because of the time. Now I know in the US there's been some broader definitions. Some will look at female suicide, some will look at all women deaths. In Australia, I think most jurisdictions have actually adopted a broad criteria that focuses on family and domestic relationships, not just intimate partners. So that's where we differ again a bit from what's happening here. In Ontario, all our reviews take place after the coroner's investigation and after all applicable criminal proceedings have happened, and that includes appeals. And so what tends to occur then is that we get a case. In Ontario, for example, it takes about 2 years for a case to go through the criminal justice system. So we're getting cases about 2 years after the fact. One of the flaws with that is that sometimes agencies who have, potentially identified that they have had a problem with responding to that case will have made a change already by the time we get the case and review it. But it's always good to see that, a committee will see a similar change as the actual agency itself has already identified. So we continue to review those cases, but we've been trying to do them as quickly as possible. And one sort of side byproduct of that is that when we first started, homicide suicides tended to be overrepresented because there is no criminal proceedings. And so we had to combat that, because obviously homicide suicides are important, but they don't represent, all the types of domestic homicides that occur. So I want to just take you through some of our basic findings from the last 8 years of our reports from 2003 to 2010. So here I'll say, on average, what we're reviewing is about 13 cases per year. And actually our last report, we ended up with 18 cases. So in total, during the 8 years, we've reviewed in depth 111 cases involving 178 deaths over the 8 years. And of those 178 deaths would be the perpetrator who committed suicide if he or she did so in that case. So our 8th annual report, which was our most recent, and it was released in 2011, and we focused on 2010 cases, and we got 18. And in case I forget to say, anybody who would like a PDF copy of any of our reports, I'd be more than happy to send any of the reports or all of the reports to you. Just have to drop me an email. I'll give you my contact information at the end of the talk. So what have we found out of these reviews? And again, I should just take a step back here and say that these are the in-depth reviews. So of the cases that don't come into the in-depth review process, we still keep basic data information on it. So we collect basic trends on all the cases. And then separately from that, I have what's called an Ontario homicide project that looks at all homicides. And so with those two key pieces of data, it provides a backdrop for the cases that we review in depth. So of the ones that we reviewed in depth, 96% of the victims were women and 4% were men. Not surprising, I'm sure, to most of you. 94% of the accused were men, 6% of the accused were women. Again, the largest majority now of types of homicides that we have reviewed are single homicides, meaning the perpetrator killed the victim and did not kill himself or herself afterwards, followed by homicides. And then we have had a smattering of attempt homicide-suicides, which we have since said that we're not going to look at because of resource issues. Multiple homicides or familicides, where the perpetrator kills the direct victim and family members, and then multiple homicide-suicides, which are familicides. Type of relationship, over half of our relationships were legal spouses, 28% were dating, which are boyfriend and girlfriend and include same-sex relationships, and then 20% were common law partner. Now, comparing this to our national data, we have an overrepresentation of legal spouses because there's more, there's a higher number of common law partners in the national data, so this is something that we're going to try to address, and that's make the cases that we review more applicable of what is occurring nationally. 11% of the cases that we reviewed involved relationships of less than 1 year. The majority were relationships between 1 and 10 years, and 32 were more than 10 years. Close to half had children in common, which was actually quite surprising. We expected more. And this number is slightly higher in the total data, but not much. And cause of death, which is consistent with the national data, is 32% stabbing, so that's the majority of methods used both in homicides generally, homicides in Canada, as well as our in-depth reviews, followed by gunshots and other types of methods. And I should say here in Canada, the spousal homicides using guns has actually been declining for about 3 decades, so this is consistent as well. So I want to talk briefly about risk factors, and I'm assuming that many people in this room are going to be familiar with the risk factors that I'm going to sort of identify very quickly, and then I want to talk about some of the work that we've done that has sort of led to the risk factors that we focus on. So these are the top 10, not to be confused with David Letterman, because I think that his topics are usually much more light. So the top 10 are, number 1, history of domestic violence, and I actually think I'm going to show this slide, because what it shows in the parentheses after the risk factor is the number of cases during the 8 years in which this particular risk factor was found. Number 2 was actual impending separation. Again, I don't think that'll be a big surprise to many of you. Obsessive behavior by the perpetrator, perpetrator depression, escalation of violence, prior threats to commit suicide, prior threats to kill the victim. Victim had an intuitive sense of fear, which I think is important for people who think that the victim doesn't know what's going on. History of violence outside the family, and the perpetrator's unemployment. Now, I want to say here that that's an arbitrary cutoff point. These are the top 10. But following close behind were substance abuse and drug abuse by the offender, gun access to or possession of guns, only by mere percentage points. So I'm just sort of highlighting these so you can see that they are consistent with the literature that you're probably familiar with, as well as some of the work of other death review committees. So we're seeing some consistent factors come up. But what I want to talk about just quickly is that knowing a risk factor is present is not as easy as I think some people often portray it to be. And that is, I think we throw around the word risk factor very quickly. And I think that it's important that we use the word risk factor very cautiously, because it's important to identify those risk factors that actually have some support in terms of having people listen to and learn about what the risk factors are. And so in terms of consistency, during the last 8 years, we spent a lot of time on discussing our risk factors and trying to figure out if the risk factors that we're including actually capture what it is that we want to include. And so in 2002, we started with a risk factor checklist that Peter and I had developed from looking at the review committees in the US that had about 24 risk factors. And just before I came here, we had an email discussion about the fact that we're almost up to 40 risk factors, and what does this mean, and how do we figure out what to do with this cumbersome list, and that type of thing. And when in reality, it may be a cumbersome list, but these are risk factors that are important to sort of keep in people's head, even if they may not often be as often present in some jurisdictions as in others. So I want to just give a couple of examples of how this evolved with respect to the risk factors. And I should also say that in the back of every report, we list our risk factors, and then there's a list of the definitions, how we define those risk factors, and we put a lot of discussion into how we define them. So, example 1, perpetrator depression, and this is one that Peter and I had many discussions about. I'm a sociologist and Peter's a psychologist, and we used to talk about perpetrator depression, and we felt that I felt maybe that we were overemphasizing perpetrator depression depending on how we included it as a risk factor. So, and Peter wanted to make sure that we did capture all the components that led to or indicated that there might be perpetrator depression. So what we did was we distinguished between perpetrator depression as identified by the family, friends, or neighbors of a perpetrator, and a risk factor that captured the clinical diagnosis. So first, these were one risk factor, and I felt concerned, and we had discussions about this, and people sort of came around to sort of seeing that these were actually two qualitatively different risk factors. If a family, friend, or neighbor says that a perpetrator was depressed, they could legitimately have the information that they need to make that assessment. At the same time, they're actually responding to a situation and retrospectively, trying to make sense of what is a horrific experience in their life, and they're trying to justify it to themselves. So the argument is that if we also have a clinical diagnosis, that gives it just one little extra layer. So we don't discount the family, friends, or acquaintances' identification of perpetrator depression, but we do sort of distinguish between their diagnosis and a clinical diagnosis, which we think is important. The second was prior threats to commit suicide. And this is another one that was really hard to figure out, well, when is it that they're actually threatening to commit suicide? You can have direct threats like, if you ever leave me, I'm going to kill myself. It's pretty obvious what they're saying. Or you can have someone say, the world would be a better place without me. And so we had lots of really good discussions about what really did count as a threat to commit suicide. And in the end, we ended up deciding that we wanted to be very inclusive in this risk factor because of subjective assessments about what people are trying to say. So we wanted to include anything that we thought could be, in the context of the files that we were reviewing, could be construed as a threat to commit suicide. So any recent, during the past 6 months, act or comment made by the perpetrator that was intended to convey the perpetrator's idea. And so we included both explicit and implicit. And they could be verbal, through email, through letters. So these are some of the discussions that we have gone through with respect to our risk factors. And we continuously go back to our risk factors to make sure that we're feeling like we're capturing what we need to capture. And the most recent one we actually are discussing now is a risk factor called victim vulnerability, which we're trying to define to capture some of the things that we just don't have in our risk factor checklist. For example, rural isolation makes a victim more vulnerable, so something that will encapsulate some of those things. So what I want to do now is I want to give you, how is my time going good? I want to give a couple of examples of how we actually use our recommendations and locate them within a case. So here I want to say that I feel that a domestic violence death review does a lot of things, but I feel one of our most concrete products can actually be the recommendations that we make. And I think that those are the things that will actually produce system change. And I'll get to moving beyond making recommendations and actually seeing them implemented in a moment. So we spent a lot of time figuring out what a recommendation should sound like, what we should say, and what particular agency or agencies should be targeted. And so a single case has actually resulted in a half a dozen recommendations. A case may result in no recommendations, and then we've had recommendations appear over and over and over again that just keep coming up in the same report, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with this issue as well, which is one of the challenges. So this first example actually had two recommendations, and this the recommendation 1 had to do with assisting the Canadian and Immigration Canada and the Canada Border Services Agency in fulfilling their duties about passing along information that pertained to domestic violence occurrences involving immigrant applicants and or their families or sponsors. So here we wanted them to communicate any information they had to law enforcement or social service agencies in the area. And I'll get to the case in a moment. And then we also wanted them to develop, and I'm just going to turn this to the PC so people can read it, domestic violence training programs for all its agents and officers to emphasize that the withdrawal of a sponsorship or denial of immigration application or claim may result in or lead to violence. And this was one of the situations in which we didn't really have expertise on our committee that revolved around immigration. And so we went to Canadian Immigration Services and said, this is an issue that we're dealing with. We need to have someone come in to talk to the committee about how Immigration Canada deals with these issues. And so the specific case that led to these two recommendations actually involved a couple, a victim who was killed by her husband following months of escalating violence, and then he subsequently suicided. The couple were allegedly involved in what was called a marriage of convenience, and the perpetrator had reportedly completed a medical degree in his country and was trying to get a job in this country. The victim had sponsored him, but she had written, previous to the actual incident, she had written to immigration officials indicating that she was withdrawing sponsorship, had initiated divorce proceedings, and feared for her life because of the prior history of violence. The perpetrator was aware that he would likely be deported and warned the victim that he was going to kill her. And she subsequently portrayed these particular threats to the agency as well. No action was taken, and the perpetrator killed the victim, then himself, one day after making the threat. So this is a case in which you would not often think of Canadian Immigration and Services as being a sector that responds to domestic violence, but this is clearly a case where in countries where you have immigration and people sponsoring individuals to come into the country, that this clearly can be a situation that could lead to escalating violence and subsequently death. And so we formulated these recommendations to respond to that particular case. So the second example I want to just briefly talk about was directed towards the Minister of Public Safety. And this one had to do with the applications for possession of firearms, which we refer to in Canada as PAL. And it talked about how we should have a medical waiver signed by the applicant so that the investigators who are looking at the application for a PAL would be able to check into mental health records of the accused, and that there should be higher standards and more restrictions for individuals applying for firearms PAL when they had previous licenses revoked or removed. This case again involved a homicide of a female victim and the suicide of her former boyfriend. The perpetrator was a member of a local gun club. In 2003, he was charged with assault against a previous common law partner, not the one who he subsequently killed in this case. In 2004, he received a conditional discharge and a probation order prohibiting him from owning a firearm for 1 year. The perpetrator's friends took over care of his firearms during this time, and we've made a number of recommendations directed at that particular issue as well. The perpetrator reapplied and was granted a PAL in 2006. During this period, prior to his reapplication, he was clinically diagnosed with panic disorder in 2003 and depression in 2005. He was known to use cocaine and was on antidepressant and antipsychotic prescription medications. He had a documented history of stalking and harassing former partners as well as the partner that he subsequently killed. Family, friends, and police were aware of the violence, but the license was still renewed. And then one final example, Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services. This recommendation pertains to police services across Ontario, and here sometimes our language is a little bit soft, and I'm going to get to sort of the uptake of recommendations in a second, but we should consider implementing procedures that stipulate that when there are grounds to arrest and or charge a person in relation to a domestic assault, and where there are public safety issues or a delay in processing the charges, the accused should immediately be placed on the Canadian Police Information Centre CPIC. So that's the database that patrol officers would have access to when they were interacting with a particular individual during the course of their shift. And it should be entered that this individual is a special interest police entry, advising that there are grounds to arrest. The case involved the homicide of a teenage female victim by her former male partner. The victim had dropped out of school around the time the relationship began and soon afterwards became pregnant. The perpetrator had a history of drug and alcohol abuse and a criminal record. He continued over the period of years. This couple had a very stormy relationship that subsequently ended up with them separating. The perpetrator continued to contact her repeatedly, threatening suicide and stalking, intimidating her and any of her male associates. The police made application for a warrant for his arrest on one of the more recent domestic assaults that was very serious. But for some reason, the paperwork ended up in the in-tray on someone's desk on a Friday of a long weekend, and it didn't get inputted until Tuesday. During the weekend, another police services, just days before the homicide, actually stopped the perpetrator for an unrelated incident and looked him up on CPIC, didn't see anything there, and let him go. And then the next day, he killed his former girlfriend. If that paperwork had have been inputted on the Friday, immediately when it went into the police services, they would have arrested the individual and prevented the death on that day. Who knows if it would have prevented it later, but it would have at least prevented it at that particular point in time. So I just wanted to provide those examples of how we locate our recommendations within some of the case characteristics. And again, I didn't go into a lot of detail of those cases because I'm restricted to what is publicly available. As I'm sure most of you know, a lot of the information can't be shared, but I think you can see with the information provided how we subsequently got to the recommendations that we did. So I just want to make 3 closing comments before I open up the floor for hopefully some questions. First, I think one of the things that I'm asked most often is, what is the purpose of a death review committee? What is the main goal of having a death review committee? And I think this is an important question because there's a lot of people out there that think that there's replication between what domestic violence death review committees do and what other people do. And I think this is absolutely untrue. I think that domestic violence death reviews are the only group that actually takes a look at domestic homicides and tries to pinpoint if there was an area of intervention or prevention that could have been taken up that would have prevented this particular case. And the optimum way to do this is to bring together a group of experts from different sectors, because it's a multi-sector response, as you well know, responding to domestic violence, to take a comprehensive look at these cases. I mentioned in Canada, coroner's inquests are only held into 1 or 2 domestic homicides for various reasons. I think that would be an interesting research question in itself, what cases lead to actually coroner's inquests. So they don't focus on all types of homicides, so there's no way to sort of identify trends and patterns. Well, I've said this before and people said, well, police investigate these crimes, and that's absolutely true. Police do investigate domestic homicides. But I think the purpose of a police investigation is for the prosecution proceedings. They're collecting evidence for a case that's going to end up in the criminal justice system. If the offender suicides after the homicide, I would argue that it's not likely that the investigation is as in-depth because the perpetrator has been identified and there is going to be no criminal justice proceedings. So the police do a thorough job investigating, but they're not investigating for the purposes of what a domestic violence death review does. And that is to identify multiple sector responses and points in the system to see what could have happened or what did happen. So they do something, domestic violence death review committees do offer something that we just don't have now, which is very important. The second thing that I want to reinforce is what I think has always been a core component of the committees when they originated in the US, and still today is a core component of our committee and other committees, and that's the no blame, no shame culture of the process. Because basically we recognize at every meeting that ultimately the perpetrator is the one that's responsible for the death. It's the agency's responses that may have allowed it to happen in some degree, but ultimately the perpetrator is responsible. So it's not to blame a particular agency, it's not to identify one particular individual who dropped the ball, even though that has to happen in a review. We have to identify people who may not have been accountable for what they were supposed to do. But we focus on the no blame, no shame. Because I think one of the key factors a lot of people recognize that will lead to some change with respect to domestic violence is changing attitudes. And you can't change attitudes if there's an adversarial sort of attack mentality in the review committee. So we always try to be very respectful of people's jobs and the constraints within which they work. And I think one of the things that's really come out of this for me is a secondary benefit, because I had preconceived notions and stereotypes about the way people were doing their job that really became highlighted to me when I attend these meetings that I didn't have a lot of information about the constraints around which these people do their jobs. Doesn't mean that we can't say that the policies and procedures that they're working within should be changed, but you can't blame someone for actually doing a job as it's stipulated in their, their institution that they do it that particular way. And I think what this is actually subsequently will lead to is cultural change, attitude change, because if we start to recognize what other people's jobs are, we may be more willing to sit back and to listen and to learn from each other. And so I talk about the 3 C's, which is communication, cooperation, and collaboration, which I think is one of the ways that we'll move forward with responding to domestic violence. Finally, we've been in existence for 8 years in Ontario, and we're still facing ongoing challenges. We realize there's a number of benefits to what we do, but there are subsequently many challenges. And one of our key challenges we've realized is that, I mentioned previously that we make recommendation after recommendation after recommendation, and we looked at each other one day and said, what has actually changed because of our recommendations? Like, had the people that we targeted those recommendations to done anything in response to our recommendations? So we have a process in place that asks them to respond to us within a year to let us know what changes have occurred, but that's actually just a recent initiative that we put in place. And so our biggest challenge at this point is to start to take a step back and to reflect on what we actually do. Are we always going to sit and recommend change and not worry about whether that change is being implemented? Or are we going to recommend change and worry and actively try to work towards having the change implemented? And with some of the child death reviews that exist now, they have a great model that we talked about, and I don't know if we'll ever move towards that, but they have a review committee, but then they have an action committee. And I think that's a really neat way to think about making sure that recommendations don't just sit there. And I think anybody who has been involved in reports, making recommendations, releasing reports, knows that often there's a lot of flurry of activity, but then nothing happens. And so at this point, our biggest challenge in Ontario, and I think the biggest challenge for many death review committees, will be identifying what our impact is. And here again, I emphasize that I think we're wrong if we say that our impact is going to be reducing domestic homicides. We can't say that. Our committees existed in Canada for 8 years, and we've had declines in homicide, but actually have had some increases in Ontario, the province that has the longest standing death review committee. That's not because we're not doing our job, it's because that there's so many factors that go into domestic homicides and will increase or decrease those homicides. You can't directly correlate the trends to the work of one group. And so my mantra is that what we do is we don't actually try to reduce directly domestic homicide, we try to indirectly reduce it through system and cultural change. And that's where we're sort of sitting. And one of the reasons why I'm in Australia at this point is to look at some of the models that are in Australia where there has been some movement towards some accountability of what recommendations are being taken up. So for example, in Victoria, they changed their Corners Act in 2009 so that there is a reporting requirement, so that when a recommendation is made, the agency that the recommendation is targeted at has 3 months to respond, and that response is posted publicly on a website. I think this is a great idea because it gives some measure of monitoring of the implementation. So that's where we're sitting in Ontario with respect to our experiences. We're very optimistic about what we've been able to do so far, but there are extreme challenges to some of the things that we're facing now, and that is basically the bottom line, is to justify what it is that we're actually doing. Thank you. So I guess I would open up the floor for any questions.
This is John.
Hello, John.
I'm wondering if it's possible to get the 40 risk factors you spoke about. Is that possible?
Yes, what I can actually do is I can send one of the reports. I don't know, do you have a listserv that gets sent out to everybody?
We can put it on our website.
Okay, so I'll make sure that the risk factor checklist and the definitions get sent to the center, and it can be posted on their website. Would that be helpful?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Maybe just a comment to say that sounds like an awesome committee that you're on. So I think that if that gets spread throughout the world, little by little, I think it's an awesome thing.
Thank you. Sometimes we think we're awesome and sometimes we don't. It depends on the day. But it's nice to hear that. Thank you.
question from Brisbane.
Hello?
Question from Brisbane. You have the identified risk factors. Do you have DV application processes where the risk factors are noted in Canada?
Yes, do you mean sort of like within policing, for example?
Well, for instance, if they apply to a court for an order, is there somewhere on the application where they can actually identify the risk factors as existing so that they can see that that particular application might have more weight?
Yes.
Or more important?
Yes, and that's a good question, thank you. There is risk factor checklists for various types of applications, and one of the things that we're currently dealing with is the varying types of lists. So lots of different lists are used by different sectors, and one of the things that I mentioned earlier about the topic of risk assessment and risk management that we're dealing with now is trying to see that if there is a way to bring online or bring in line across a variety of sectors some of the most common risk factors so that people are using the same indicators. So yes, the short answer to your question is yes, there is a risk factor checklist, but it varies depending on what sector is being accessed by the victim or the offender. Does that address your question?
And yes, just a second part to it. Is that on court applications, or in Canada, do you have court applications which are the same for both police and private applications?
You mean for like civil protection orders? And yes.
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 Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions from outside Mackay? Okay, so any questions from Mackay? After years of teaching, I've gotten used to silence, so it's fine. I used to try to fill it, but...
I know that you only recently started asking for responses from agencies regarding your recommendations, but over the last 8 years that you know of, have any of those recommendations actually been used, implemented?
Yes, okay, so thank you, that's a good question. One of the reasons why we realized we had to be more systematic in trying to understand what recommendations had been taken up was that our knowledge about what recommendations actually did get translated into action usually depended on individual members knowing about or being involved in particular movements. So for example, one of the largest categories of recommendations is around public education. So we spend a lot of time talking about education of professionals, which is extremely important. But we also know that family and friends in 3/4 of the cases know what's going on as well. And so we've made multiple recommendations over the past 8 years with respect to educating neighbors, friends, and families. And I use that term because we have now in Ontario a campaign called Neighbors, Friends, and Family. And it's a training module that goes around to different communities and talks to communities about how people who have knowledge of a victim or a perpetrator experiencing or perpetrating violence, how they can help. And understandably the key is to make sure that they remain safe as well, because there's potential risks for bystander intervention. But what people might do, how might they connect a victim with services they need, how might they talk to a perpetrator, so that type of thing. So that's been one of the outcomes. We've also had a number of recommendations that have been directed at family doctors. So family doctors often have a lot of knowledge about a victim's experience of violence. And in Ontario, there's now an online training website that doctors can do. It's voluntary, but it's a module about teaching family doctors about domestic violence dynamics and what questions they might ask victims who they may suspect are experiencing domestic violence. So yes, there are things that give us the energy to keep going that we can find out about, but it's the fact that we just don't know everything, and we want to be more systematic in it. So there has been positive outcomes. Thank you.
I've got a question, but I'm not near a microphone, so...
You can come up here if you want.
Yeah. Well, I might do that because we probably should be looking up some...
I was really interested in the work that you're doing, Myrna, around looking at the closing the gap in terms of gender inequality. And I just wondered whether you or others are also looking at other kinds of inequalities, and whether any of that's coming through in the work that you do on the committee in terms of different dynamics or different kinds of socio-demographics within the range of deaths that you've been reviewing.
With respect to the committees, I think that's what we're trying to get at with our new discussion around victim vulnerability, because there are particular victims that are facing structural inequality as well as gender inequality in relationships that we don't capture with our risk factors. So we're hoping to get to a place where the victim vulnerability label, although some people are not quite happy with the vulnerability label, but that will encapsulate some of that. With respect to my own research, we've done some work, and there's a publication that I can forward to you that has looked at Canada in terms of employment, occupation, income, and education levels, and has looked at divorce and marriage rates. Where I'm focusing most of my work right now actually is on the third risk factor, and that's increasing domestic violence resources. And so a couple of years ago, Department of Justice Canada funded a workshop that we brought together individuals from across the country to talk about what are some of the resources that we want to measure. Because ultimately I think that we can identify communities that are, for lack of a better word, adequately resourced with respect to responding to domestic violence, and those that are not. So what should a community look like if they have an adequate response, both within criminal justice and community-based agencies, so that is maybe a standard against which we can say this community is severely under-resourced.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Any other questions? I'm thinking that we're probably going to lose the connection shortly, so if, maybe one last opportunity for a question from outside of Mackay, if there is one, before I wrap it up. I think
Yes, hi, it's John. You spoke about victim vulnerability. I can't remember what you spoke around. Can you add anything to that, thanks?
About victim vulnerability? The concept itself, you mean, as a risk factor?
Yes.
Yes. So that issue has come up on a risk factor checklist. We have a section for risk factors that the reviewers might see as present, but aren't on the list. And so over a period of time, we've noticed that there's particular things that are on that other list that we want to capture. And one of the things that they seem to have in common is victim vulnerability. And by that, I think one of the best examples that I can think of was one of the cases that I reviewed, in which it was involved a police officer, a retired police officer, and his wife. And the retired police officer killed his wife, and there was a history of domestic violence. And his wife actually had called police on a couple of occasions, but when the police came, there was nothing said. She was very unwilling to talk to people about it. So we started talking about how a person's particular occupation can, or their partner's occupation, can make them particularly vulnerable to domestic violence or actually dealing with the domestic violence. And in this case, and there's a lot of literature surrounding this, within the police culture that sometimes fouls, and even female police officers and male police officers themselves are subject to domestic violence, and it's something that they don't want to talk about. Because we also had a case in which a female police officer killed her male police officer partner and then suicided afterwards, and they didn't get help because of the sort of the machismo, I don't know if it's still there, but the sort of the more masculine, we can deal with our own issues culture within the police. They didn't talk about it to anybody. So it's trying to capture some of those things, and we've been having a lot of difficulty actually trying to come up with a definition that will get at those things so that reviewers know what we mean, and if they see it in a case that they'll know that that applies. And one of the main goals of actually having these detailed definitions is for continuity over the life of the committee, because committee members will change and we want to make sure there's consistency in the risk factors. So that was a very long drawn out explanation. Did that address your question?
That was lovely, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, I think I will wind it up now. I just wanted to say again, thank you, Myrna, for making time to be here with us. It's really is fantastic. I think what you've presented to us is a very clear and comprehensive overview or insight to the work that you do with the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, and just the value of that work. I think that there are probably some people around the state who have a good understanding of what is involved with these committees, and I think that there's the information that you've provided, I think, is probably been very valuable for many of us who don't have and won't have the opportunity to sit in on a committee and actually see how it operates. So thank you very much for such a comprehensive and clear presentation.